CBD doesn't get you stoned like THC. Well, what's the implications of that? Well, that means people who aren't comfortable with the experience of getting high on marijuana and who would not ordinarily think of reaching for marijuana as a medical option now can and are doing so. Because CBD, depending how much of it is present in a given marijuana strain or product compared to the THC present, can either lessen or completely neutralize the high of THC. So it's not just that CBD is not psychoactive like THC, but when together, it will actually temper the high. It will, depending how much is in there, it could lengthen the high, but it lowers the ceiling on the high. You don't get as high, but the medical effects can actually last longer. So the relationship between CBD and THC, the high causer, tetrahydrocannabinol, is something we'll look at a little bit. CBD is not so easy to find in most strains, even in most strains of industrial hemp. It's in very small amounts. It's mainly the THC in marijuana. But there are a few strains now that are available that have either high CBD, low THC, or some combination of CBD and THC, and all these strains are potentially useful. But there was an interesting study in 1980 in Israel, a clinical study involving children with epilepsy. There's only about a dozen subjects in the study, but it showed in every situation CBD either lessened or eliminated convulsions, seizures. And yet we knew about this now in the scientific community in 1980, and yet it just fell by the wayside. But now it's been rediscovered. President Reagan for this somewhat, it's a bit ironic, because during the Reagan presidency, there was a relaunching of the drug war, and they made a decision to put a lot of money into figuring out what marijuana does to the brain. And it was assumed that it would be a harmful effect, and that this would, if they put millions of dollars into studying it, they would figure out why. So millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars went to studying marijuana's effects on the brain, except instead of documenting how it harms the brain, they ended up funding research that led to the discovery of what we call the endocannabinoid system. And this is a huge, huge discovery, and has huge implications for nearly every area of medical science. So what do we mean by endocannabinoid system? Because it's the underlying basis for marijuana's utility as a medicine, and also marijuana's utility as a recreational substance. The National Academy of Science. And this study, the headline is Endogenous Cannabinoid Signaling is Essential for Stress Adaptation. That's an example of one physiological process that the endocannabinoid system regulates. So what do we mean by that? Okay, hear a loud noise, a gunshot, you get, that's the fight or flight. Stress hormones surge in your body when you're feeling stress. Well, something has to kind of turn that back down and bring you back to normal baseline level of your stress hormones. Otherwise, you'd be stressed out for your whole life. And that's what the endocannabinoid system does. It's essential for stress adaptation, as this publication indicated. I just described a situation for acute stress. Something happens. What scientists have determined, when one is confronted with an acute stressor, what it does is provoke an uptick of your endocannabinoid signaling. Your body produces more cannabinoids in response to the stress hormones to bring them down. That's what it does for acute stress. Temporary rise of cannabinoids then comes down to a baseline level. But for chronic stress, what the scientists have learned from studying, interestingly enough, alcoholism. Alcohol is a stressor, it's a poison in the body. From studying alcoholism, the scientists found that the chronic stress, the chronic exposure to alcohol or another stressor will lower the baseline level of your endocannabinoid signaling. And this will make one vulnerable, basically, to more diseases. And you think about it, when an alcoholic goes into detox, what's the danger if they go off? Seizures, right? Well, why are they vulnerable to seizures all of a sudden? So I want to talk about this notion of that there could be a deficit or a lowering of your normal cannabinoid signaling in the body, which is so essential for so many physiological processes. If this lowers, you become more vulnerable to disease. Here's an example from a PTSD study that was done right after 9/11. In Lower Manhattan, there was actually Canadian scientists did this study. They found 25 people in Lower Manhattan who actually presented with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks, and 25 people living in the same neighborhood who did not, all from the same area. So why did some people come down with PTSD and others didn't? Every single person who came down with who presented with PTSD had low levels of cannabinoid signaling. They were able to measure the amount of cannabinoids in their body. And the normal folks, quote unquote, who did not suffer PTSD had a normal baseline level of cannabinoid signaling. So this is a protective apparatus. And when it gets lowered, and why does it get lowered? When it does, you get vulnerable to many different kinds of diseases potentially. So why does your cannabinoid levels, your natural cannabinoid level, get lowered in the body? It's because we go through life and we accumulate stress, all kinds of stressors. I'm not just talking about a bad day at work, it's stress, or a bad relation stress. I'm talking about all the unregulated chemicals in our environment, bad diet, et cetera, et cetera. Stress builds up. As we age, we've accumulated stress through our life, so as we age, we are more vulnerable to disease. Because stress underlies so many different diseases. It's a part of so many different diseases. Stress affects how we metabolize glucose, how we, so many different things stress will have an adverse effect for. And if their body can't adapt to stress well, we are more vulnerable to illness. So there's actually been a name for this book coined by Dr. Ethan Russo, called endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. And he has linked it to migraines, to irritable bowel syndrome, to fibromyalgia, that people with these conditions, and they often happen in clusters. If you have fibromyalgia, you're more likely also to have migraines and irritable bowel. When you have diseases that would reflect an endocannabinoid deficiency, but there also could be diseases that reflect endocannabinoid excess, because the imbalance can go either way. That would be like obesity or diabetes or metabolic syndrome would be an example of an excess, an expression of endocannabinoid excess. Because when it comes down to it, any disease will involve a dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system, because it's sort of like your first protection against disease, because it's regulating the immune system. In some ways, it's even more primary, you could say. So there are also genetic factors that might influence how we experience the levels of our own cannabinoids. We might have a mutation in a gene that encodes a receptor in the brain. If that's the case, you can have a lot of problems, so forth and so on. Anyway, let's look at the next slide. We're going to move these. The good news is that there are many ways to enhance one's own endocannabinoid system and to enhance endocannabinoid signaling, as it's called. Through diet, through a proper diet, you can boost your own endocannabinoid system. Through exercise, it turns out when you exercise, you stress your body, and it's like an acute stress, so that the runner's high you experience afterwards, that's your endocannabinoids sort of surging in your system. That's why you feel that kind of pleasant feeling. Acupuncture, osteopathy, all these, it's been documented, at least some of the health benefits of those things are conferred or are mediated through the endocannabinoid system. Fascinating work in China, for example, in military hospitals of all places. They're doing work showing how the pain-killing effects of acupuncture are actually mediated by the cannabinoid receptors. So medicinal herbs, many of them, it turns out, interact with the endocannabinoid system, not just cannabis. But certainly cannabis is very, very unique because it has a very direct connection to the system. So that's the title of this abstract. Beta-caryophyllene ameliorates the Alzheimer's-like phenotype in certain kind of mouse through CB2 receptor activation and the PPAR gamma pathway. So they've documented how when this component of the in vegetables, black pepper, and also in marijuana, when you take it in, it can actually mitigate the progression of Alzheimer's by binding to a cannabinoid receptor and one of these receptors on the nucleus. So this is all some of the science that's coming out now. Next slide. Alzheimer's, dementia, obviously great concern to seniors. There's just some of the statistics that you may be familiar with, but it's predicted that by 2050, so we're talking just a little over 30 years, there will be 13 million Americans with Alzheimer's, 160 million people globally. So it's clearly it's a serious issue that's looming. THC and CBD both have an effect of an anti-Alzheimer's effect, you might say. It was discovered at the Scripps Research Institute, not far from here in San Diego, I believe it's, that a THC, the high causer, actually inhibits an enzyme that's involved in the formation of the beta amyloid plaque that's associated with Alzheimer's. It's not clear if it's causative or just part of it, but it's clear that THC inhibits this enzyme that's crucial to the development of dementia in this way. And so does CBD have an effect like this, but acting in a different way in the brain, not through that particular enzyme. There was also an Israeli study earlier this year. There's a lot of interesting clinical research going on in Israel. They have the support of the government there for a very vigorous medical marijuana program that basically concluded that cannabis oil was a safe and promising treatment for Alzheimer's dementia, not just simply to hold off the progression, but actually to even reverse it somewhat. So it's very hopeful there. Now, in ancient China, where we have the first human pharmacopoeia was established, they described cannabis as one of the elixirs of immortality and said it helps with longevity. And here we have modern science saying the same thing. And the key thing is cannabinoids protect neurons in the molecular level, and that even the progression of normal brain aging can be suppressed by cannabinoids, longevity. How CBD and THC interact together, they tend to potentiate each other's medicinal properties, and that's significant. Next slide. An example of that, we have a study, the headline, CBD enhances the inhibitory effects of THC on human glioblastoma cell cancer, cell proliferation and survival. So CBD enhances THC's anti-cancer effect for brain cancer. But the point is, this is very exciting, very hopeful, very promising. There's a great deal of potential here. Now, for the last slide, I just want to read this quote from Dr. Todd McAree, who is a leading physician in the medical marijuana history in California. He's since passed away. But I thought this is worth thinking about. He says, we should be thinking of cannabis as a medicine first that happens to have some psychoactive properties, as many medicines do, rather than as an intoxicant that happens to have a few therapeutic properties on the side. And it kind of turns things on its head, and it's sort of refreshing to think of it that way. This is Project CBD. We encourage you to go to the website. A lot of information there. I just scratched the surface of so much of it. I appreciate your attention and hope you can visit us and sign up. We have a free newsletter. We don't bombard people with emails. A couple of times a month, we get something very interesting and very new in terms of medical marijuana. Thanks very much.